Welcome back to Hazel's Flight School. I'm Lily,
And I'm Maximilian Girardin.
and today we're talking about what's in that barrel.
So, a lot of times people look at barrels of whiskey and they say, what's going on in there? And I'm going to go over it really quick because it's very complicated, but it's really important to understand that what's going on in that barrel is really the most important part of what makes whiskey whiskey. So when you put your spirit in a barrel, you take it off of your still and it is clear. It looks like water. You put it in the barrel and it starts to take on all of that color. What's actually happening is that the water is very, very slowly evaporating out through the barrel, as well as a bit of the alcohol. As that water and alcohol is evaporating out through the barrel, it's breaking down all the connective tissues in the wood, the lignins, the tannins. Now that barrel is going through a very slow breathing, flexing process as it gets hot and cold over the time that whiskey is in it. That breathing process forces all the stuff that's been broken down back in. Now those things that have been broken down from the woods, the lignins, the tannins, all those natural chemicals, come back into the spirit and they start to esterify, which is a very complex process of a chain of lipids getting more and more complicated, which is why whiskey off a still can have some mouthfeel, but whiskey that's been barrel aged for a very long time will have a lot more texture to it because those lipid chains, think like peanut butter, that's all lipids. That's a very thick thing on your palate and tongue. So that was a lot of words really fast, but it gives you a good idea of kind of why it's important that things are barrel aged. Now, in front of us, we have Green Spot. Green Spot is a personal favorite. It's a single pot still whiskey, and that refers to its mash bill being a mixture of malted and unmalted barley. Started being a style back in the 1790s because the Irish were avoiding the tax man. The British were imposing a really nasty tax on malted barley, or just malt. And so to get around that higher tax, the Irish said, why don't we just do unmalted barley and malted barley and pay half the tax? So it's around a 50-50 blend of those two different grains, fermented together, distilled, and then barrel aged. Go ahead and check it out. I'm a huge fan. So for me, the presence of malted and unmalted barley makes this a more textural experience than a lot of other whiskeys. It's soft up front, but there's another note in here. Can you pick it out? You're on the spot.
Green apple.
Yeah, totally. There's a green apple note, definitely. I get a fair amount of like a red fruit and a little bit of a nuttiness, and that's from sherry casks because they're not just using oak barrels, they're using oak barrels that previously held others of their whiskey, other people's whiskeys, and other people's wines and dessert wines. So Green Spot is a mixture of largely ex-American bourbon barrels, which have been used so much that they're almost inert, and sherry barrels from Spain, which is a dessert wine that's fortified. It gives you that kind of sweeter red fruit kind of note.
So the barrel aging process is so important because when the whiskey is aging, it's basically taking those flavors of the wood. If it hasn't been used before, it's picking up those flavors, and if it has been used, then you're getting those sherry notes or whatever wine or other spirit which aged in it before, so you might see it impacted by those.
Exactly right. And so you see a lot of people doing barrel finishes, and the one caveat that I would add to what you were saying is that if it previously held Green Spot's whiskey, they dump that and then they use it again, and they use them over and over and over again. But the fresher the cask is, the more of certain notes it imparts. The older the cask is, the more reused it is, the more neutral of an flavor profile it imparts to it. Yeah.
So if somebody pulled the liquor off the still and decided to age it in metal, it would not be whiskey. Whiskey isn't whiskey without the barrel.
Correct. That's absolutely correct. And by a legal definition, it has to touch wood in order for it to be a whiskey. I think PBR did one years ago where it touched wood for 3 seconds, and it was
And it
a
still
white
counted.
whiskey. Yeah.
Interesting.
Which is pretty cool. We should move on to the yellow spot. So The difference between the green spot and the yellow spot is really obvious and on the middle of the label. It is 12 years old. So green spot, Irish whiskey, minimum 3 years of age in oak. For yellow spot, because it declares that it's 12 years, the youngest component in there is 12 years. So we're at more than 4 times the youngest component of green spot. And I don't want to be misunderstood. Most of what's in green spot is far older than 3 years, that minimum. It's just that the youngest possible could be 3 years. So with this, the youngest possible is 12 years, but they're still blending in many barrels that are far, far older.
So the age on the label is always the minimum.
Yes, with only a couple exceptions, and those are all in the rum world, because rum just doesn't really have very many rules. So with this one, with an older whiskey, the fundamental difference being that this one is so much older than this one on the average and at the minimum. Did you pick up on any differences? Because they are fundamentally the same whiskeys.
It seemed more mature, and the flavor pattern had almost progressed from green spot to yellow spot. I picked up like more dried apricot in this. It seemed there was less, it wasn't as bright. It calmed down in a good way.
Absolutely, yeah, you're right on the money. And so one of the other words for barrel aging whiskeys is resting or mellowing, right? And it mellows it out. The other thing that you totally caught was that it feels more mature, it feels more complex. There is a very defined beginning, middle, and end on older, well-matured whiskeys. You get a front of palate, you get a mid of palate, you get the back palate, you get the breath out afterwards on the finish, and they all have their own flavor. And that's a hallmark of just a really well-crafted, very mature whiskey. Now we have a treat. We're going to try the Gold Spot. Sweet. All right, so we are now on the Gold Spot. This is a special treat. This bottle is no longer available anywhere that I know of unless you're getting it on the secondary market from some bottle flipper and you're going to pay 5 times its price. The Gold Spot, fundamentally different from the other ones that we've had. It is 9 years at the minimum, but they have the addition of Bordeaux casks, which are French wine casks, and port pipes. And port is a kind of similar to sherry, but coming from Portugal. It's a fortified wine. It's desserty. Depending on what kind of port, whether it's ruby or tawny port, you'll get different levels of oxidation, different flavors, but I tend to find it influences whiskey in a very specific way. See if you can pick it up. Any notes?
I mean, on the nose, it really reminds me of oak on a white wine.
Mm-hmm.
Getting a lot of vanilla, some caramel, a little bit of that coconut in there. It's great.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and those notes that you all said, I actually tend to not associate with port as much as I do with that French oak, right? Those like almost baking spice and toasty vanilla and coconut flakes. That's all stuff that gets. The port component of this that I pick up on is like a dark red fruit, like a very subtle kind of juicy touch on there.
Yeah, and I would say that component for me with a less experienced palate just comes off as sweetness.
Mm-hmm. All right, so our last whiskey of the Spot line is the Blue Spot. Blue Spot is highlighting ex-American bourbon barrels, and while all of these for the most part touch ex-American bourbon barrels, remember I said they're reusing them so much that they're almost inert for some of them. Whenever a producer, especially a larger one like the Middleton family and the Ian Mitchell, decide to highlight bourbon, they're telling you that it's first fill or second fill bourbon casks, ones that still have a ton of bourbon influence on them, because remember, in bourbon you use casks how many times?
What?
One time, and then you dump it and you send it off to Ireland for these guys to make whiskey out of.
And circling back to reusing barrels,
Yeah.
if a whiskey producer is using the same barrel over and over and over, eventually will the alcohol begin to lose those flavor components as they're leached out of the wood?
Absolutely, that's a great question. Yes, and barrel blenders and producers love to have these old workhorse barrels that have been in their distillery sometimes 50, sometimes 100 years that they've used over and over for different batches, because it gives them a variety of profiles that they can taste and say, wow, this one's got just a very subtle, still very grain forward thing, but it's also very old. I can blend that into this very young one that doesn't have much graininess, got too much vanilla, and find the balance there. And I'm oversimplifying just the spectrum of what happens, but the more that, because the whiskey is all the same coming off the still, all the same stuff. The differences come in the barrel maturations that are happening. So giving yourself a broad spectrum of different influences from different barrels means that you can blend to different specificities.
Gotcha.
Yeah, great question. Awesome. And the blue spot, which I love. Now, this one is the strongest one of the whole lineup at 112 proof? 117.4 proof. And that's way up there.
I would not have expected it to be that proof. It
Right?
doesn't taste like that.
Yeah, right? It's easy drinking. Now, part of that is that the age range is 7 to 20 years old. After 20 years in a barrel, almost nothing is going to really punch your teeth in. But another part of that is just that it's blended to be this way. It's really made to be a soft and drinkable whiskey with a lot of backbone. You can feel it warming you up. I'm almost breaking a sweat. Yeah. Awesome. Well, that was a quick and dirty look at barrel maturation and the spot whiskeys. We would like to thank Debi Sipperley from Southern Glazers Wine and Spirits for supplying these awesome and actually stunningly rare bottles for us to try today. And did you learn anything?
I learned what's going on in that barrel today.
All right.
Thanks for tuning into Flight School. Subscribe to us on YouTube and come fly with us again next time.